We better get going back in the direction of productivity. As you're taking your seats and coming in, I'll tell you a story. Somebody was asking me about N.T. Wright giving a lecture, and I lived in England for a year, and straight out of West Virginia, my normal attire was blue jeans and a flannel shirt. Rode my bike everywhere, and N.T. Wright was giving this lecture at some academic hall, and I thought, I'll ride my bike over there and listen in. And I walked in the back. It's Oxford. It's one of those very elaborate, ornate Anglican cathedrals, and the place is packed with everybody in like black tie affair. Clearly, I had misjudged what this was, and there I was in blue jeans and a flannel shirt, and every seat was taken in the place. And I'm like, that's fine. So I sat down along the wall in the back, like in the aisle where I could see up to the middle, and then there were two other people that were back there also. So they get up, they do all the formal introductions, and he was written a new book and was on a tour and all of this. And right as the lady was she had already introduced him, and right as she turned to sit down, she said, "Oh, I'm worried about those of you who are sitting on the floor in the back." She said, there are seats up here for the choir that you can come. So the three of us came down the side, and it turned out there were only two seats. So the two people in front of me took the two seats, and then I was just standing there. So here I am, it's 500 academics in their gowns and N.T. Wright and me standing there, and the lady doesn't know what to do, and up behind the pulpit is this huge ornate chair with like eagles coming out of the end of the armrest and everything. She's just like, just sit up there. So here I am in my flannel shirt in a chair that has eagle heads on the arms with N.T. Wright in front of me speaking, and I remember nothing of what he said, because but I did have a buddy from Egypt who came in the back, and he knew I was in there. And he's looking. I can see him looking for me, and then he looks up, and his eyes get this big, and he just folds over laughing and walks out the back. So that was the last time I heard N.T. Wright in person. Well, not actually, but one of the times I heard him in person, I don't remember a thing of what he said. So there's some kind of the first shall be last and last first, something that should, maybe. But I had hinted to the idea of what I wanted to address here, which is this idea of a bit of a blessing of heading back to where we started from. And to get there, this is a book by Alan Kreider called The Change of Conversion and the Origin of Christendom. And he's mapping out the impact that Christianity had on the culture based on what the expectations in conversion were. So how was the church teaching about conversion? And then what type of disciples did that make, basically? And then that flavored the types of Christendom that arose around the church. But one of the key elements and ideas that were in this is that he's talking about the church being formed in a time in which it was not politically advantageous. There was no advantage to being a Christian. You wouldn't just say you were because there was some benefit to it. You either were or you weren't. Living in New England for a couple years, it was the same thing there. If you bumped into somebody in, Boston who mentioned that they were a Christian, you had a live one on the wire. Like, they weren't saying that just for the fun of it, or they thought that did anything for you socially. They really meant it. And what cracks me up is I'm going to read you a quote from a guy named Herbert Butterfield. And in 1949, he wrote this sentence: "After a period of 1,500 years or so, we can just about begin to say that at last no man is now a Christian because of government compulsion, or because it is necessary to qualify for public office, or because public opinion demands conformity, or because he would lose customers if he did not go to church, or even because habit and intellectual indolence keep the mind in the appointed groove. This fact makes the present day," this is 1949, "this fact makes the present day the most important and most exhilarating period in the history of Christianity for 1,500 years. And the removal of so many kinds of inducement and compulsion make nonsense of any argument based on the decline in the number of professing Christians in the 20th century." Here's the line. "We are back for the first time in something like the earliest centuries of Christianity. And those early centuries afford some relevant clues to the kind of attitude to adopt." And so the argument that he was making in 1949, and I would say here we are 77 years later, is that we're actually trending culturally in a direction that is more similar to the context out of which Christianity grew than at any other point in history. And so we can look at the world around us and say, what is going on? there are all these differences, there are these interesting opinions, there are confusion about definitions of everything from marriage to gender to whatever, and we don't recognize this world. But if you go back far enough, that is exactly the set of conditions that Christianity originated in. And so you could say, well, we live in a sexually confused time. Well, I wouldn't recommend going back and looking at the street art in Pompeii or reading most of Roman history. Like, no, actually kind of mild. It's good comparatively. And so what that does is it sets up an interesting format in that there are a lot of people who are like, you know what? At some point, Christians or the church is just going to mature and they're going to get over some of their archaic ideas about the way that the world works. They're going to grow out of the ideas that they have about sex, for example. Forgetting that the church actually flourished and came out of a even more diverse context. And so did you ever read the story of Burr Rabbit? You know the story of Burr Rabbit and the Burr Rabbit and the Briar Patch and how it goes along where he's, how does that one even start? Where Burr Fox is trying to catch the rabbit and so he makes the tar baby and he says good morning to the tar baby and the tar baby doesn't respond and he punches it and gets stuck in it and Burr Fox catches him and is going to kill him and Burr Rabbit says to him, please skin me alive. Whatever you do, skin me alive, but whatever you do, don't throw me back in the briar patch. And the fox thinks, well, okay, that's an option. And Burr Rabbit says, well, maybe hang me, strangle me, please strangle me. But whatever you do, don't throw me back in the briar patch. And so he goes through this whole list of like all these horrible ways in which he wants the fox to kill him, but says, whatever you do, don't throw me in the briar patch. And the fox finally thinks, well, the one thing he really doesn't want is to be thrown in the briar patch, and I do want to torment him, so he throws him into the briar patch, and then he hears him laughing, and what's he say? I was born and bred in the briar patch. Will it look difficult for you? This is home for me. And I think that similar thing will develop, either has or is in your lifetime, or will be in the future of the church, in which there is a difficult, tumultuous culture in which we live, but the church was born and bred for the briar patch. That is, Jesus shows up in the middle of the chaos. And that is the story. I mean, it's the story from Genesis that God brings order out of chaos. And so as you think through that, and it's kind of an interesting little read of how then in the briar patch, in the chaos, was the church discipling and calling people to actual behavioral change, not just the transition of ideas in its origin. And there are 4 categories that the church, the early church, and this comes from Justin Martyr, who is way back there. And he's writing that here are the categories that the church was trying to get people to think about and to overcome. These are the difficulties. So here are the big 4. You're going to want to write this down because you will never have heard of any of these. I guarantee it. So Justin urged the Christians to resist the demon's power in 3 areas to which, across centuries, pastoral theologians have been attuned: money, sex, and power, to which Justin added a 4th, the occult. These perennial areas of addiction and compulsion were clearly issues of conflict and conversion for Christians in Rome. And they may have been areas of struggle for Justin as well. Repeatedly, he uses the word we. The first area that he mentioned was sexual adventure. Quote, we who once rejoiced in fornication now delight in continence alone. The second was the occult practices. We who made use of magic arts have dedicated ourselves to the good and unbegotten God. About the final 2 areas in which Christians had struggled for liberation, Justin wrote in even greater detail: acquisitive materialism. We who once took most pleasure in the means of increasing our wealth and property now bring what we have in common fund and share with everyone in need. And xenophobic violence. We who hated and killed one another and would not associate with men of different tribes because of their different customs, now after the manifestation of Christ, live together and pray for our enemies. So there you have, we're knocking on 2,000 years ago, that the Christians in Rome, as people were trying to come out of a chaotic culture, the church said, here are 4 areas of interest, 4 areas of specific teaching that you're going to have to give up your addiction to: sex, money, power, violence. And it's a good thing you wrote those down, because that doesn't ring any bells for our time, right?
Say this. How did you didn't say occult. What did you say?
He uses the word occult, but yeah, spiritualism, spiritual practices, you could, so occultic practices, false gods, witchcraft, that kind of thing. So, is it comforting Or is it of interest to you that the things that sometimes you think are a new issue in the world around you aren't? Yeah. We've been at this for a little while. But here's the exciting part of this, or one of the interesting things, is that sometimes, if this is true, then as an individual Christian, as a family, or even as a congregation, when we start thinking about how do we engage well with what is coming in the future, that the answer to that lies in the rearview mirror, not out through the windshield. Because if there are Christians who have figured out how to do these things well for 2,000 years, I mean, that would be a starting point at least, right? In working through that. And so that's a kind of an encouraging spot to start with, of saying, how do we want to talk about these things? How do we want to address them? Are there ways in which we actually can live different lives? And the thing of it is that Justin Martyr and Kreider both use the words of addiction when talking about this. And I was discussing with one of you this morning some of the conversations I was having in my home congregation of just pointing out that really the best addiction recovery programs are at least a year and are residential. You go, you change your community, you're living in a facility, you're living with a community, and you're totally reorienting the habits of your body and the habits of your mind, and it helps you break an addiction. And sure, there are places you can go short time, quick interaction, maybe halfway houses, dry out sort of thing, but really the lasting change that we see is when people go and live residentially and recover from addiction in that way. And so the conversation then becomes, based off what I've been discussing and based off things that are mentioned in this book, is at what point do we start to visualize and to conceptualize discipleship as addiction recovery? To call it what it is to say, we might think about something like we have an addiction to caffeine or sugar or whatever. You pick your poison. Did I just say caffeine was a poison? You sort that one out on your own. But do you think of living in a culture that's addicted to violence? Do you think of that as an addiction? Or money, sex, power, wealth as an addiction? What are the characteristics of having an addiction? You can't not do it, right? I have a neighbor who's about 9 months into being a Christian, is addicted to everything. He's like, I'm great at counseling people who have addiction problems because I've been addicted to them all. He said, my thing wasn't one drug, it was instant gratification, and all of these will do it. But he said, it's wild now to be a Christian and to have the ability to say no to things. He's like, I've never had this in 44 years of my life. The ability to be like, actually, I'm going to pass on that. Do you have the capacity to look at some of the categories of the things that the world around you offers you and say, no, I'm going to pass on that? And not just because it's bad, but because there's a different and a better version of this. Justin Martyr, when he's talking about the occult, and I mean, have you noticed traveling around, maybe not here in your part of the world, but any small town now has 2 or 3 witchcraft or Wiccan shops, and the probability of working with somebody who's practicing, tarot cards, the whole thing is just on the rise. Number of people talking about crystals, and I was visiting, speaking at a church down in New Orleans, and we were going down through the streets there, and all these crystals are for sale, which I didn't know, like if you're lacking just joy in your life, you could buy the right rock and tuck it in your shirt and that would solve all your problems. Who knew? But we went past this one table and there's joy and happiness and peace and love and all of that. And the guy's like, look at that, for $8.99 you can buy the fruit of the Spirit. You just got to buy the right crystal and tuck it in your ear and you're good to go. The desire, the clever, the curiosity there, the playing with the spiritual realm, the interest in that there is something more, but I want to take that spiritual reality and craft it and use it for my own gain. Justin Martyr and the other early church people writing about this do not say, that's a bunch of silliness. That's not even true. That is not the approach they take. They're like, that is absolutely real, and it works, and we used to do it. There's actual spiritual power in these practices. We know because we used to do it. But we don't anymore because it's of the devil, and we follow the true God. It's a very different approach. The approach to that on the spiritual practices was, we know something that is better and more powerful than that. We're not denying the efficacy of it, or the fact in which you can monkey around with the spirits of the world and have actual things happen. And that makes a whole lot more sense of all of those of you who lived in different places or read the shaman and the witch doctor practices of the different cultures, like they're actually making real stuff happen in the world. Pharaoh's magicians pulled off a decent chunk of the list of things that Moses was able to do, right? And so the posture of the church toward the magic arts and the dark arts has not been like, nah, there's nothing to it. It's like, no, that's real. Do you believe that?
Yes.
And it's puny. we serve the triune God. And so that's one of those where it feels like some places where I'm like, we just act like, oh, well, that's like they read too much Harry Potter, as silliness. Like, no, that is how most of the world sees reality. And so this level of engagement with these ideas is not to dismiss it in a just like kind of way, but to say, no, this is a real thing that a lot of people are involved in. And we used to do it. In fact, I love all of those lists in the New Testament of like, these are the people who won't inherit the kingdom of God. And then the next line, like in 1 Corinthians 6, and that is what some of you once were, but now. And so it's a story of conversion, of just transformation, of saying, yeah, there was a time in which we tried to use spiritual realities and spiritual practices to cultivate the world into our own image. And the thing of it is with false gods is that you always start off thinking you're controlling them. And then wake up one day to find out that they're controlling you. Every single time. My grandpa pointed this out to me one time. You can only walk away from the true God. You can't walk away from a false God. If you're addicted to something and you try to walk away from a false God, it'll kill you. Right? It's only the true God who lets us go. And so there's a sense here in which we get captivated by these things and lured into them, and then we need to snap out of the bondage and the oppression that is there. And that's why so much of Jesus' ministry, it's not like they brought him a demon-possessed person. He's like, demons aren't real. Remember that part? No, he doesn't do that. But the other thing is that Jesus treats the demonic like me flicking a fly out of the window. I mean, it's no big deal. He doesn't go through complex incantations. He doesn't act like there's this big cosmic battle. He's just like shooing the cat out the door, kind of. It's no big deal. It's just orders of magnitude different in the power that is manifest between who Jesus is and what is represented by the power of God and the power of darkness. I think there's a subconscious belief, even within the Christian world, that there's a battle between good and evil. And they're pretty much equal and opposite forces, and they're balanced. And we're going to see which way it goes. And unless I jump on the side of good, God's not going to win this one. It's not even in the same order of magnitude of the power. Satan is God's Satan. He is a creature also. And so there's a sense in which I take spiritual realities very seriously, but also don't lose any sleep over it. Not because I don't think it's real, but because I know what is more real than that. My brothers and I had a dumb game when we were pretty little, like much shorter than a farm gate. And the game was this, is there were certain cows that if they gave birth, the trick was to see if you could go tag the cow and get back over the gate before the mom got you, which we should have had a TV and this would have solved a lot of things. But and so we had this wonderful little barrel roll over the top of the gate to get away from it. And so you're trying to sneak up on a calf, right? We were not at all concerned about the calf. It was the 1,200 pounds behind the calf looking at us that bothered us. And so Satan's not scared of you. But it's what's behind you that keeps him at bay. That is the spiritual reality that we live in. It's what is within us and behind us and for us that keeps us at bay. And so there's a twofold way to go wrong on this. One is to completely diminish it, act like it's nothing, silliness, or become infatuated with it, and there's a demon under every teacup, and we have to always be, crossing ourselves in the right way and getting out, and there's always Satan's about to get us. Both of those are extremes that we don't want to slip into. We want to have this balanced view of, yeah, it's a reality, but we're worshiping and following and are under the power of something far bigger. When my grandparents were missionaries in Ecuador, we don't think about it, but part of the joy of becoming a Christian in that part of the jungle was recognizing that the other spirits no longer had power over you. We don't celebrate that at our baptisms of like, yes, all those demons that have been haunting me no longer have control over my life. But for a lot of the world, that is the reality of becoming a Christian. A great book on this is The Spirit of the Rainforest. I don't know if you've ever read that one. It's a story of shaman coming to faith in South America. And so you look at some of the witchcraft, Wiccanism stuff is what my brother called it, that it's kind of the cute, fun, witchy stuff of America. And my brothers call them JV witches. Like they're not really varsity witches. You got to go to South America for that. But it sounds like I'm being trivial of this, but I was talking to 2 professors at Harvard one time who were classics, and their whole thing was to get high on mushrooms and then cultivate certain spirits that would help them read the classics properly. And you're like, okay, these are theoretically highly educated people. Another time I was speaking to a young guy, actually at Harvard also, and he came up afterward and he said, so there's a spirit that speaks to me through the cartoon character Pluto. And I could see some of the other Christian leaders like backing up like, okay, what's going on here? And I said, when were you in South America last? And he said, I was just there this summer doing some ayahuasca trips with the shaman. I was like, I thought so. And everybody's like, what's going on? I mean, this is not fringe anymore. This is mainstream conversation that I'm having with people on a routine basis about their spiritual interactions. And it's also interesting that in the New Testament, a lot of the references to the word sorcery is pharmaceutikos, that there's a chemical link between drug use and spiritual manifestation that we should be aware of also. And so to be a church who functions in a modern time in which I think the harsh materialism is falling apart and is seen as an avenue in which, there's got to be something more. People have that sense. The thing that I spent so much time, like 10 years ago, convincing people that there's a spiritual realm, that there's more than the physical and the material. And now I find myself talking to people where I'm trying to convince them that the physical world is real, because they live in such a far out, twisted, hypothetical vision of reality. I told one of the young people in my church, I was like, I'm talking to this person, they're driving me nuts, not because they don't believe anything, but because they believe everything. It's like, come on back down and get your feet on the 3D reality with me here. And so as a church, we just have to be aware, like we can't stick our heads in the sand, that this is alive and well. It's a place of deep curiosity for many people. It's a place of deep entanglement for a lot of people, and that there will, in fact, be people who will come into your church that as part of your counseling and their conversion are going to need to be delivered from having been messing around with some pretty dark stuff in the past. It still has a firm handle and handhold on them. And that's a reality, and it's not a problem for the Christian. Right? Just know that's there. This is a world that has a situation. It's been there through all of church history. We've forgotten about some elements of that, perhaps in some, we could say more about that. Maybe we'll get into that in the Q&A. Then the limits of power and violence. How far are we willing to go? On what topics? What is justifiable? What is Christ-like? What is Christian? What are the actual limits of what we allow ourselves to do? What are the tools that we will use in order to bring about our will in the world? You probably come from a church who has a certain set of historical traditions and convictions and thoughts and interactions on this topic, but it's a pretty easy one to disappear pretty quickly also. But you can't have a conviction about something that is based off of just the past or routine or tradition on this. This has to come out of a continual development of thinking, I want to reframe the way that I see reality and humanity. I have a very good friend, lovely Christian brother, who got convicted about his concealed carry permit. And he said, the way that I had to come out of that and the way that the Lord was working on me is that I would just practice sitting in a public space and looking at people and saying, made in the image of God, made in the image of God, made in the image of God, made in the image of God. And so I try to do that practice sometimes too. Made in the image of God, made in the image of God. God definitely has a sense of humor. Made in the image of God, work it out that way. But it's a habitual practice for me and for all of us as believers to it can't be based off of the tradition or, what Justin Martyr said about it way back then, but what is it that God is forming in me of saying, what are the boundaries here? What are the things that I'm actually afraid of? That's a good question if you were to write that down and think about that tonight when you're at home. What am I actually afraid of? And being able to identify that is a valuable thing. Is fear a Christian state of mind? It is not. And so there's a sense here that this is one of those categories, again, where most of you, looking around the room, are not going to have to decide whether to launch a nuke tonight. Like that. We always think of the extremes on the far end of that. But all of us are probably going to have the opportunity to verbally turn the other cheek, to let something slide past, to forgive a grievance, reconcile something with a neighbor, family member, all of these things of a positive vision of saying, it's not that I'm not pursuing violence. Again, it's not formed in a negative. It's saying, okay, look, the demonic is real, but there's something more true to that. Violence is real. It's the way we throw our weight around. It's the way that we are naturally born and structured and ordered to pattern. It's what we want to do. There is nothing that Jesus teaches that comes naturally for humans. It requires transformation at all categories and all levels. And so to ask myself, what am I growing toward? I think on the violence one of the ways, actually all of these categories, whether it be sex, money, power, or the occult, we can start to see a little bit of a posture in our hearts of what do we use as entertainment? What types of jokes do we laugh at? What do we think, that's kind of cute or funny? And my boys were up to something the other day. And
How old are they?
these two are 11 and 9. And I said to them, I said, guys, what you pretend is actually practice. Our fantasies, where our mind goes, what we're daydreaming about, is actually preparation. What would we do in that situation? When I'm pretending, if you think of your pretending as practice, where does that lead you? You're fantasizing, where your mind goes, where it wanders. And we live in a time in which a lot of people say, well, it doesn't matter what I think, it's what I do. What are the outcomes and consequences? We all know that life is like riding a motorcycle. You tend to drift where you're looking. It's just as simple as that. That's the reality of the game. And so I think there's very much in all of these categories room for repenting of things that we think, not just things that we say, and not just things that we do. And there's real freedom that comes in that, but I think starting at that point of, hey, stuff pops into my mind, and I say, Lord, I would love to never have that thought again. Forgive me of that. Take that from me. I want to stop it back there, not all the way. It's the heart, soul, mind, strength, the totality. It isn't just can I put on the veneer of this action and behavior. God sees through all that shenanigan. Just to start and say, wait, what is my actual, what are my emotional responses when I see things of violence happening in the world? Where am I tempted to use power in an un-Christ-like way? And what we see again is that, we sing about Christ could have called 10,000 angels to destroy the world and set him free when he's on the cross. I one time took the kill rate of the angel of the Lord in the Old Testament, what was it, 185,000 in a night, multiplied that by 6 legions in the population of the earth at the time of the crucifixion, and figured out how many seconds it would have taken for the 6 legions of angels to destroy the whole world population. I do a lot of math in my sermons sometimes. And the summary of it was Jesus was packing heat. He could have. He would just had to say the word and it would have right there, but he didn't. And what we see routinely in the life of Jesus is him choosing not to do things that he had the power to do. Repeatedly not doing the things that he had the power to do because he had a bigger vision. And that is a fight in our own lives that we will have to overcome, is to say, just because I can doesn't mean that I have to. When it comes to violence, when it comes to power, when it comes to getting my way and throwing my weight around. But again, it's not that I'm not trying to not do this thing. It's that I'm trying to model and to live this. You see the pattern that's happening here? It's not a call to, let's just focus on the bad thing and not doing the bad thing. It's like telling your kid to go stand in the corner and don't think about a pink elephant. That's impossible to do. You're going to think about a pink elephant if you're told not to think about a pink elephant while you're standing in the corner. There's that form of an attempted self-balance correcting sort of thing that just doesn't work. It has to be overrun by a better vision of a bigger glory that gives us a direction and a purpose to go in our lives. And the same thing is true with wealth, with money. Jesus talks a pile about this, about getting distracted and hung up on this. And it's here's the challenge for me, is that social and cultural stability usually does manifest itself in economic stability. And so as people come into our church and it stabilizes their relationships within the family, it stabilizes their relationships with their employment and with the world, there usually is an economic benefit that comes from salvation in a real way that manifests itself sociologically. Some of the parameters of how that gets worked out in our time are very different. Even in the last 5 to 10 years, some of where wealth comes from has gotten a little confusing, and how money is made and who's swapping and trading what, and it's a wild, wild world out there. But to think about value as something that I am continuously trying to get is ingrained in the way in which we're formed. And the gospel is all structured around what we can give. And so the money isn't bad, the love of it is the root of all evil. But it is a shocking thing to try and there's so many good Christian financial gurus out there who have so much good thought on this. And one of my brothers said to me the other day, he's like, I used to like listening to Dave Ramsey and the whole, and he's always bashing on the callers for their dumb decisions and everything. But he's like, even there can be a hyper focus within the Christian world of stewarding our finances well that is still a hyper focus on finances. And so I'm trying to recognize economics is important. God does want us to be a good steward, and also wants us to realize that the economic reality, or the portion of the pie that is our life, that is about our money, is a very tiny sliver. I want to be free to do stuff that is economically stupid in a God-honoring, responsible way. That doesn't make any sense. Why would you go do that? Well, it doesn't make any sense. But this is what God has asked me to do. I want to have the freedom to do that, to not be held to, I have to look at the totality of my life, and when I'm 67 and a half years old, am I going to have the right? I'm not saying don't be responsible, but how do we set that in the proper little corner and say, the Lord will provide, the Lord will take care of it. What do you really want me to do? And I have found in my life, I hope it's true in yours, that if God is in something, then the money usually isn't a problem, right? He can make it happen. And so I want to take the infatuation that I see in the world around me that is so concerned about that and set it aside. And part of it is it goes back to what I was saying last night about the amount of people who are running around the world frustrated with God for not giving them things he never promised, is that will be, I think, a portion of a challenge for many of the historic and perhaps specifically historic Anabaptist churches that have been pretty close to the land and have owned, and over the generations of familial stability, accrued some pretty nice pieces of some things that have turned out to be pretty valuable these days, right? And then it's interesting to talk to churches who are Mennonite churches, not you guys, whatever, other places who are like, we're planting this church in this urban context where everybody is very poor. Nobody owns land. Nobody was a farmer. Nobody has and what does it mean to be a Mennonite that doesn't have access to the traditional Mennonite resources? That's it's not good, bad, or ugly. It's just an interesting question to say, obviously we know there's more to our faith than how many cows your grandpa milked, but it's still kind of there, right? And so to live into and to model something, I think this might be the hardest one for the Anabaptists that I know. Out of the sex, power, violence, occult, and money, this might be the one where we're the most likely to get a little twisted around, because we have been blessed in so many ways. And even those of us who don't own land are still networked and connected in with people who have the resources to make splendid things happen. But let's always remember that this comes from God, and it's a tool. And we're not going to lose sleep over the silliness and the shenanigans of that. Now, I think that this is another one of those categories where clear biblical principles of discipleship, honesty, integrity, and some basic, I think math is a moral issue. Fudging numbers is lying. Let's put it that way. Treating people with honesty, integrity usually turns out to be a better business practice. And so there are all these secondary derivatives of the blessings of following Jesus in this way that do manifest themselves as wealth. But when you look at the history of Israel, God repeatedly blessed them financially and monetarily and materially, and they repeatedly blew it. How's the King James put it? Jeshurun grew fat and kicked. And there's these cycles of they just couldn't handle the blessing. Maybe it's not even just wealth in dollar signs. I was telling a friend of mine the other day, we were talking about just the number of Christian leaders who have blown it. And I said to him, he had written a book, and I was like, you know what one of the greatest gifts God could give you is for your book to become a bestseller after you die. Right? Or you did it because God asked you to, and you weren't even around for the success of it, because that's going to save you a whole lot of heartache and confusion. And so putting ourselves in that way of using money. One of the funny ones that happened years ago, I like telling this story, is my dad was selling 2 tractors, I guess. And a guy called and said, hey, I'd like to buy this one tractor, and I can come this evening and get it. And Dad said, well, you can come and look at it, but I actually promised another guy that he could look at it tomorrow. And the guy said, yeah, but I'm coming tonight and I have cash, like I'll get it. And Dad's like, yeah, I know you said that, but I told this other guy that he could look at it. And the guy's like, well, that doesn't make any sense at all, because you're selling it and I'm coming to bring you the money for it, so you should sell it to me. And Dad's like, look, I recognize that I shouldn't have told this guy that he could look at it tomorrow. He's like, it's a bad business deal. But he said, no amount of money that you can offer me is going to change the fact that I told this guy he can come look at this tractor tomorrow. He's like, it's not worth it to me to have that cash for me to violate my trust with this guy. And the guy's like, let me guess, you're not going to sell this to me on a Sunday either, are you? And Dad's like, you got it. Well, 5 minutes later, the phone rings. Same guy. He's like, so this other tractor. He's like, does it run? Dad, yeah, does tires, rubber, yes, so that hours, whatever. And he said, okay. He said, I'm sending a guy to come get it tomorrow. Dad said, you're not going to come look at it? And the guy's like, no. He's like, you told me everything I need to know about it. And Dad's like, you're really not going to come look at it? He's like, you just told me there was no amount of money that was worth your integrity. Why would I spend my time coming over to look at that second tractor? I'm going to send somebody to come pick it up. And it was one of those funny where 5 minutes earlier he was mad at him because he was somebody who was going to keep his word. And then he's like, this saves me a bunch of time. I think you're an honest person. And so you get funny little stories like that happen, but the value of that for my brothers and I, watching our dad do business like that, was far more valuable than the amount of money. And I don't even remember the second guy came and bought the tractor or not. But it's just putting limits on saying there are just certain lines that money is not going to be the decisive factor on whether or not I say yes to this or whether or not I do this. And even if my dad didn't need to sell that tractor on that day to pay whatever bill for that month. But even if there wasn't a cushion, to say, I'm not going to let this prioritize my life. Why? Because the prayer, what did Jesus teach us to pray? Give us this day our daily bread. Unfortunately, that is not a long-term investment strategy. I would love it, like, give us this day our next 14 days of bread, something like that. It's just not there. And so again, it's not because it's bad. It's not because it doesn't work. It's just that I have a higher vision, a higher picture of what I want to see happen in the world. And then finally, just to make this interesting, in a short amount of time, we have to talk about sex, which is a category and a topic that the world is seemingly infatuated with and totally confused about. And because of the wonkiness in the ways in which the world presents this, sometimes we lose our Christian voice on recognizing this is a good thing that God made. It is a gift to us from God, and it has a purpose to it that has to do with reproduction and fidelity in relationships and the establishment of the people of God. It's interesting to me that throughout Scripture, particularly in the Old Testament, that sexual immorality is treated like an act of domestic terrorism. You notice that? In the Old Testament, pretty much the punishment for every sexual sin was death. Is that not just a little over the top? I mean, we have some sense here that the punishment should fit the crime. What's going on here? And you recognize that from the beginning, God intended for there to be a man and a woman who are married to each other, and that out of that union, there would be a family that builds out of that, and out of that family, there would be a tribe who would become the people of God, who would fill and steward and appropriately manage God's creation. That's the plan. And so you think of this stacked hierarchy from the bottom up that includes sex as one of the fundamental portions of that, and you sort of have this stacked tower of Jenga blocks in which sexual sin is like flicking out the bottom block of this whole entire fabric and cosmological vision that God has created. And so that's why it was protected as such an extreme thing, because of the extreme potential and value that it has as a good thing for the world around us. And that's last night when I was talking about, particularly in sexual ethics, of us saying, well, here's the vision of the world and here's the vision that we have and we have to fight about this and argue about it. It's like, no, actually your view is too low here. I've repeatedly found that in most of my interactions with genuine non-Christians who haven't been like inoculated against Christianity, but have a genuinely non-Christian view of reality, time and time again, my vision and version of the value of their life, of purpose and meaning and goodness and truth and beauty are all superior to the story that they're telling themselves. It's a wild thing. Have you ever counseled somebody who's suicidal and realized that you have a higher value for their life than they do? It's a weird feeling to say, look, I know you don't see this right now, but I would like to lend you my faith. Trust me on this. Your life is worth far more than you realize. Let me loan you this idea until we can get you stabilized here. And the same thing is true of all of the spiritualities, of violence, of money, but especially of sex, of saying there is a better way that God has created and calls us to grow up into. And so these are, we probably should have taken a lot more time to discuss each of these in even greater detail, and they could all be good sermon series or Sunday school discussion group for whoever's leading stuff out there, or studies in your home or your house, or things that you personally want to look in more to say, what is God's vision of the way in which I use my body? We'll talk about some more of that tomorrow night, but about my finances, about really what are the boundaries and the limits of how I want to think about what Jesus is calling me to in response to violence and power, and then into the spiritual realities and the way in which I pray and how I engage evil. These are all wonderful things. But it's uniquely fun to think about a world that has historically been caught up in these things that we have the answer to. The world is craving legitimate stability, legitimate hope, and the church has it in spades. And I so often feel like I'm in life of standing, like where two hallways intersect, and I'm standing in that intersection, and I can look down this hallway and I can see a group of people who have a question, and I can look down this hallway and see a group of people who have the answer, but they can't see each other because they're around the corner. And our job as Christians is to make the transition, say, hey, psst, come over here. Look at it this way. What if there really is a God who really does love you, who really does have a powerful, meaningful way in which he wants to see you engage in the world? And when Jesus says, come follow me, I like Steve Garber's definition of discipleship, where Jesus is inviting us to come look over his shoulder and through his heart. Look at the things that I'm looking at. Focus on the things that I'm calling you to focus on. And then see through my heart. Look at the posture at which I'm engaging the world around me, and then replicate that. That we would be conformed to the image of the Son, the perfect one who is perfectly in the image of God, which is what we were created for. When I go to an art museum or I see a beautiful work of art somewhere, I never take a picture of the artwork itself, but I frequently will go up and take a picture of the tag, the name tag. Whose image is on this thing? Who created this? I want to know something about the creator, that this beauty was inspired in their mind and they created this thing. And in the same way, God has created a beautiful universe and then stamped his image on it so that we would live our lives in such a way that when people look at us, they're impressed with him. Whose image is this? Who created this? What is this all about? There was an old professor at Eastern Mennonite Seminary, was retired by the time I knew him, named Herman Reitz. Herman the German. And Herman was a great friend and mentor to me. And Herman, when he saw me, would say, Nathan, are you living a doxological life? What a seminary professor thing to say. The question is, are you living a life that glorifies God? Do you engage in a reality in these categories in a way that it testifies to that there's something bigger and more beautiful that is an invitation, a taunt, saying, yeah, okay, you guys are playing with the little kid stuff, but step up here into reality. This is what God has created. Can we image in that way? Can we glorify God in that way? Can we live a doxological life that he would receive praise from the way in which we engage a weary world with this good news? And so we'll leave it at that. We're out of time. Thank you for your patience on that. And be thinking about questions, and we'll start off next time with the ruminations that have happened in the room this evening and go from there. But be encouraged to know that some of the silliness that you see in the world around you is not new. The church has responded to it, and not only responded to it, but grown out of it in meaningful ways all throughout history. And I see no reason that if we're willing to put ourselves open-handedly before the Lord, that he won't use us to do the same in our time, in our lives. Let's pray. Lord, we give you thanks for another opportunity to gather together on a beautiful day and to be reminded that you've got the whole world in your hands. It's not a kid's song, it's a reality. And may we live well in the light of that in a way that is invitational to a weary world who needs to know of your goodness. So use us as you see fit and help us be truly open-hearted and open-handed and open-minded before you. We ask for your help in this in the name of Jesus and by the power of your Holy Spirit. Amen.